concrete was flying everywhere.
There were people crushed, trapped, and dying everywhere you looked.
You could hear the kids crying.
I remember people were being found 4, 5, 6 days after the earthquake. Alive.
Good evening, and welcome to iRemember, a unique journey back to the major events of our times, recalled by the people who were there: reporters, producers, cameramen, participants. During the next hour, we'll find out what it looked like, how it felt, and what our eyewitnesses think now about what happened then. Tonight, we look back to September 19, 1985, just another day in Mexico City. Then the ground began to shiver for what seemed like an eternity. It was the beginning of a massive earthquake that would level vast stretches of Mexico City, leaving a sea of human misery in its wake. And it all happened so suddenly.
There was one hard jolt, and then the ground began to roll.
The whole thing was really moving just like if you were in a wave.
You're waiting for the end of your life. That's what you see.
There was virtually no communication, as I recall. Nobody knew what was going on in Mexico, except it was bad.
I hope to find my children. I hope they are safe. I hope they're still healthy.
You couldn't pick up a phone and call somebody and say, "Where's the damage?"
We raced to the Santa Monica airport to get on a Learjet to get down to Mexico as quickly as we could.
I get to Mexico City with a crew like 2 in the morning or something, and we have no idea what's going on.
The devastation was so widespread and communication so bad that only tonight did it become clear that this is a very major disaster, perhaps the worst in Mexico's history. Finally, there were shortwave radio accounts confirming the worst.
It's the taller buildings that are more affected. Some of them, few have completely collapsed. The concrete slabs look like a club sandwich.
The main part of town that was hit was more or less what is known as Midtown Mexico, and a lot of these were apartment houses, and they crumbled and really pancaked is the word to use, because the tops just came down and settled on the ground.
Several tourist hotels were badly damaged.
And our hotel started to move a lot. And then this tower of the television, it fell out.
We were tossed around constantly, and we went partly dressed downstairs. We had to because the room was falling apart and concrete was flying everywhere.
How many bodies might be buried under this tons and upon tons of rubble? Who knows? Mexico has been hit with just the force of a mighty blow from hell.
One of the most striking things as we drove into Mexico City was what collapsed and what did not.
There were areas that were just nothing but rubble. I mean, just horrible. And there were other areas that were absolutely untouched.
Largely, it was the newer buildings that collapsed. The 100-year-old adobe structures, which had held up for centuries, held up again.
There are gas leaks and fires burn in many parts of the devastated city, claiming still more lives.
We thought now we are going to die. Burn and crushed.
In hospitals throughout the disaster area, many of the severely injured are dying. Crying children and men and women wander through the streets searching for their loved ones. In all, more than 250 major buildings, some of them skyscrapers, collapsed.
I remember thinking at the time that it was as if a giant had walked through Mexico City and crushed certain places with his feet and missed other places. People were forced into the streets because their homes had been destroyed or because they were terrified their homes might collapse on them.
Everybody was scared. A lot of people just crying. A lot of people on their knees praying and just asking God, help us.
Sí, es mamá y hijo.
With the aftermath came all the extremes of human emotion: sorrow, anguish in the presence of death, the miracle of a life spared simply by chance, and panic.
Are you all right?
Help me, please. Nancy! ¿Estás sola?
Nancy, are you alone?
I'm with my husband, but I don't think he's alive. We are missing 7 people from our building. But I'm sure they're all dead.
The first thing I felt from the minute I got there was a kind of queasiness. There's dust in the air, smells, all kinds of terrible smells everywhere. And things were falling down and the earth opening up and gas leaks all over the place, and you never knew what kind of horror you'd encounter at each step. And part of it was the awful realization that there were people crushed and trapped and dying everywhere you looked.
iRemember will return. The Mexico City earthquake measured a staggering 8.1 on the Richter scale, making it one of the biggest quakes in Western Hemisphere history. The actual site of the earthquake, though, was nowhere near Mexico City.
The center of the quake was in the Pacific, 50 miles off the coast from the country's biggest resort, Acapulco.
Our assignment was to go to Mexico outside of Mexico City, cover the earthquake damage outside. We reached Acapulco at midnight, I think it was long after dark.
At the discos in Acapulco last night, there was cause for celebration.
It woke me up, and I thought my wife was shaking the bed. And I looked over at her, and I realized that it wasn't her.
I thought I had too much to drink from the night before, but when I saw the tables and the lamp shaking, I knew something was wrong.
The town was absolutely fine. We didn't know that till we got there. That morning we had, because we'd taken off in such a frantic race down here, we weren't prepared. The hotel had no food and no water, and the only thing we had on the airplane, as we were taking off this beautiful sight of Acapulco with the mountains behind, sun just coming up, all we had was beer and fig Newtons to eat at 7:30 in the morning. We knew that we had to go to several different cities in the outlying areas of Mexico, and then back to Harlingen, Texas, which was the closest feed point in the U.S. By 6:30 Eastern time to get that story on the air. We flew from Acapulco to Guatemala and on to Lázaro Cárdenas, where I remember some people had been killed and a fair amount of damage. And by that time, our time was out, and so we Learjetted back toward Harlingen. But of course, we had to clear customs. We stopped in Monterrey, and I knew that it was going to be dicey by this time. And we got to Harlingen Airport. We ran red lights, did everything to get to the station in Harlingen. Marilyn Carruthers was the editor. She worked like a maniac. I remember running across that patio and up a flight of stairs into the control room to feed that tape out.
This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather.
I mean, the show was going on the air.
Terremoto. Earthquake.
We just made it. I mean, it was about as close as it can be.
The scars from the earthquake stretched more than 200 miles from Mexico City to a number of cities on the Pacific coast.
It's sort of interesting that Acapulco, which was much closer to the epicenter of this particular earthquake, didn't have anywhere near as much damage as Mexico City, way inland.
Seismologists today analyzed why the effects of the quake were so catastrophic. Mexico City, they agreed, was more vulnerable to this disaster than any other major city in the hemisphere. This megalopolis was built on top of a series of lake beds, and the movement of any quake is amplified many times.
When she saw that the part of the wall collapsed and crushed her brother, then she realized what was going on.
Yo estaba en la sala junto con mi mamá.
When the roof fell in at Yadira Bravo's house, the 10-year-old girl's mother was killed. So her little brother died as well. There was a feeling of desperation, of need on the part of neighborhood people to save their families, to save their neighbors, not wait for somebody to come with a front-end loader or a crane. 12-year-old Freddie Velasco fell from his family's 10th floor apartment when their building toppled.
My little sister, my mother, and my father are still missing.
This is what is left of the building. Freddie has not been told his family was killed.
If they couldn't reach their father or their mother or their children in the rubble, they had to feel that they were doing something.
Brick by brick, wall by wall, and floor by floor until they got those who were still alive out. Time lost meant lives lost.
Silencio. When they needed to really check because they thought they heard something, or the dogs would bark indicating that they found something, they would put their hands up and silencio.
Silencio, and the whole vast area of rubble would fall quiet.
And the entire audience, all the people who were around, the press, the family members, the bystanders, would hold their breath, and they would listen.
And you would hear a plaintive little sound, and that would guide the rescuers, give them a better idea of where to dig next.
It was spiritual as well as it was listening for sounds.
And then this whole human machine would start up again, and they'd start going and going and going.
You didn't know whether there would be another earthquake. And you didn't know whether to sleep with your clothes on or not, or you didn't know whether it mattered. And you could never kind of shake this kind of fear that was with you for the whole time, that the next thing you knew you were going to be sandwich meat.
On Thursday, there was the shock. On Friday, the aftershock.
The aftershock hits, and the building begins to shake.
I saw the chandelier going like a pendulum, maybe 5 feet on either side of center, swinging above me. The shock caused some buildings, damaged earlier, to collapse. You feel sick to your stomach, and you don't know what to do, but your instinct is to somehow get out of there and live.
People were trampling each other.
Trying to get down the stairs. There was a fair amount of panic.
One of our drivers had a broken leg in this mob scene. I'll never forget the scene of all these people rushing out in tears, hysterical, fearing for their lives.
As the earth shook, people were overcome with the desperate, dizzy feeling of having nowhere to go, no place to hide. The fear that's associated with an earthquake is that no matter how smart you are, no matter what you think you can do, you cannot think your way out of it. You can't strategize in any way. You're going to die or you're not. You're going to get out or you're not.
Your adrenaline pumps as it's never pumped before.
You couldn't ever think of anything more terrible. I've covered a number of wars and faced directly head-on guns, people with guns to the back of my head and so on and so forth. Nothing of that type is nearly as frightening as a natural phenomenon like an earthquake.
Tenemos que salir del edificio. We have to leave the building.
High-rise tourist hotels were evacuated briefly and checked for structural damage.
I'd like to send a message to our family in Dallas that we're okay, the whole family.
People were shrieking and yelling, and there were cars, horns blaring in the streets, and people trying bumper to bumper to bumper to get out of town. Eventually, I was able to go back to my room. I pulled back the curtain to look out the window, and underneath the curtain, underneath the window, there was a split in the wall of my room, that wide. I reached my arm through to the outside, and wiggled my fingers in the daylight outside, and I thought, nice safe place.
Ironically, that room turned out to be one of the safer places in the chaos that was Mexico City. I Remember will continue. earthquake left a huge footprint, not only on Mexico City, but also on the surrounding countryside. Nothing, it seemed, was spared.
They had seemed unchangeable, these adobe neighborhoods in Ciudad Guzman, an old farming town 250 miles from Mexico City. The earthquake proved they were not.
This was now 2 days after the earthquake. The government was in with bulldozers, and they were just flattening the houses.
On some streets, machines are finishing what the earthquake started.
I think they were concerned about aftershocks, and they thought a lot more people were going to be killed.
Maria Campos had lived here for 40 years. She collected a few possessions and left her home to the bulldozer.
Well, I remember those people fleeing with their belongings here and there, running with chairs and potted plants ahead of the bulldozer. There were few belongings that were left, and their houses were being leveled. These are houses that people have lived in for, I suppose in many cases all their lives.
Compared to the capital, the official numbers are not large. But here, everyone seemed to know the victims, know the faces of the suddenly homeless.
There seemed to be no concern at all for the feelings of people forcing them out like that. And so it was kind of a double tragedy.
They couldn't believe what was going on. And it took the weariness and the time and the death watch to kind of bring home to them what was really occurring. There was a great deal of praying. They thought they had saints with them, that somehow God would pull them out of this disaster.
Nuestra tierra se está haciendo.
The world has not ended, he says. These are natural forces at work in the universe. There is no reason to blame God.
Echarle la culpa a Dios.
The churches were astonishing because they were on an assembly line, sort of a cycle of masses, practically 24 hours a day, mass after mass after mass, to cope with the needs of the people.
These people have been through 2 massive earthquakes in the span of 24 hours. And now, day by day, they were literally trying to pick up their lives, pick up what was left of their homes, and get on with things. Not the least of which was finding out who also survived.
And in the streets of Mexico City, other survivors, the new homeless, camp out and make do as best they can. No one has an exact count, but it's believed they number at least 50,000.
Buildings are being condemned every day. They evacuated 150 about 100 feet from where we're standing last night, put them on the street, and there were 27 babies in arms, and it was raining, and they didn't even have plastic to get under.
More poor and homeless in a city already swollen with poverty and unemployment.
They're getting the water out of holes in the street. They're sleeping on the streets, or they're walking around all night. Everywhere you go, you see tent cities.
I think the disaster was too enormous for the government to handle all at once, quickly.
What there was not where it ought to have been. There was a shortage of water. There was a shortage of tents. There was a shortage of food. There was a shortage of medicine.
We had a weak, paralyzed, helpless, confused government that didn't really know what it was doing. President de la Madrid's government didn't know how to cope with the earthquake itself, didn't know how to cope with the issue of how many people had died, terribly conflicting versions, didn't know how to cope with the question of foreign aid, to accept it or not accept it.
At first, Mexico said that it didn't need the help from abroad.
The government did not know what was really happening or what really happened.
There was Mexican pride saying, we can do this ourselves.
The government did not want a foreign closeness to the damage, to the number of dead, to the corruption that could arise in the way the aid was being handed out. It was very reluctant to allow any foreign assistance.
Wants him. The search for one boy in one building has come to symbolize Mexico after the earthquake, or perhaps to overshadow all the boys in all the other buildings.
I don't know to this day whether I should have believed that the tappings were actually happening, that someone could have heard him speak, or whether it was all just fantasy.
And how does one know there is no hope when, in this particular disaster, day after day, when hope was lost, another miracle emerged.
The Mexican government just, in the end, had to be hard-headed about calling off the search for the living and drawing a line and saying, enough. It was very painful for the people who had to just say, that's it.
After fighting against people that wanted to get with the bulldozers in there, and I decided to just hold down until midnight. After midnight, I screamed silencio, and we sat there for probably almost an hour, and we didn't hear anything. And that's when I took the decision, okay, let the cranes come in and take off.
It was time for the living to begin putting their lives back together. I Remember will return. The devastation from the earthquake was so total, the damage so widespread, that it took a very long time for Mexico City to get back on its feet. But slowly, life began to return to normal.
A year after the disaster, we returned to Mexico City. One of the things that struck me was going to the cemetery. There were hundreds of graves with the same date.
There were hundreds of bodies that were never found. That meant that there was no closure for the people involved. They turned to God, but at the same time, you could see that this was just a terrible, terrible thing for them, with no end ever.
We still feel the pain. We feel their absence, and yet their presence. So we came to say goodbye.
The immediate disaster was tragic enough, but it was, in a sense, the first chapter of a new tragedy.
A full year later, perhaps 500,000 of the earthquake victims are still suffering, still without the permanent homes they lost, still living in the cramped quarters provided by the government. There are blocks of the one-room, corrugated steel shelters in the city, unheated holding rooms for residents bitter over the pace of reconstruction.
They have made a lot of promises, but they haven't given us anything.
One psychological effect of the earthquake was the sense that the government was no longer able to address the concerns, the needs, the aspirations of the people. That, I think, lasted and is still with us today.
There were a number of situations where people couldn't forget and were going on with life.
24-year-old Dr. Juan Hernandez remembers he spent 4 days buried in the collapsed Juarez hospital, where 900 doctors, nurses, and their patients died.
The doctor was back at work and felt more committed to saving lives.
Fantastic.
Oscar Flores, the man who came out of the rubble of the apartment building, decided never again to live in anything taller than a single story.
In the end, God left us here, so we can't fall behind with trauma. I feel this part of life I wasn't supposed to live, and I try to enjoy it to the max.
In Mexico City, a number of the babies were reunited yesterday for a birthday party, a celebration of life and survival. These are the miracle babies, the twins, Juan and Jose, little Maria in her birthday best, a weary Adrian, and in a tiny farming village far from the capital, a baby girl named Griselda in the reassuring embrace of her grandmother, will live and laugh for one more day in the poverty her mother fled, for the good life in the city.
I think the survival of infant after infant said something about the strength of the people. It became a rallying point for people to have the strength to start over. If the smallest of us can make it, surely the rest of us can.
It gives you the power to keep on going and to have the faith and the expectation that tomorrow the sun comes out for everybody again.
For I Remember, I'm Leslie Stahl. Good night.